Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this introduction to what the Realisation Festival is about. My name is Pippa Evans, and I'm one of the programme coordinators for Realisation Festival. And I'm just hosting today to allow us to find out a bit more about what Realisation is. Realisation Festival is happening between the 9th and the 12th of June 2022 at St Giles House in Dorset. And we're trying to do something different. We're trying to create a space where people can come and reflect, to figure out what we might need to unlearn and reimagine to be sort of citizens of this world, this confusing place that we live in at the moment. But when we're trying to do something different, it becomes very difficult to explain what we're trying to do. So we thought what we'll do is put together this evening talk, so we might get a little bit closer to giving you a clearer sense of what we hope to achieve during that weekend at St Giles. Realisation Festival is a combination of a collaboration, I should say, of people coming together from Perspectiva and St Giles House. So we thought what we'd do is we'd start off with Jonathan Rowelson from Perspectiva, the director of Perspectiva, talking about what realisation is and why we might want to spend a weekend thinking about it. So Jonathan, if I can hand over to you, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Pippa, and good evening, everybody. I'm assuming we're all coming in from the UK. Anyone who's not in the UK, put your hand up, please. Hey, Helen, oh wow, my goodness, more than I bargained for. Briefly then, so each of you in turn. Helen, where are you coming in from?
You mean me? I'm from the Netherlands, The Hague.
Netherlands, great. And then Lauren?
I'm from Paris.
Wow, okay. And we thought, was it Vanessa, I think, as well? The others who are not from the UK? Yeah, Ellen? Where are you coming in from?
I'm from the Netherlands.
Okay, so we have a good Dutch contingent. And anyone else want to say where they're from if it's interesting?
East Tennessee.
East Tennessee, that's pretty interesting. Well done. Travis, nice to see you. So welcome all of you from wherever you're coming in from. I'm Jonathan Rowelson. I'm director of Perspectiva, which is one of the two sort of partners involved in this festival, the other being St Giles House. So St Giles House is the venue, a beautiful, stunning sort of country estate in Dorset. That's just a great place to be in. And the festival is almost worth coming to just to be there. And I keep saying be because that's how it feels. It's very much a place to sink your roots into and allow the sort of elements to wash over you for 36 hours or whatever it will be. It's replenishing, it's stunning, and it has a certain energetic quality that's hard to put your finger on, but it's a combination of the history of the place, the architecture, the landscaping, and maybe there's something more mystical going on about, who knows, ley lines or God knows what else, but there's certainly something interesting happening in the place. It's a great place to be. And Nick can speak to that in a moment because it's his house and where he lives. My job here is to just endorse and affirm that that's the case, that it's a great place to be, but also to speak to the kind of substance behind the event and how it came to be to some extent too. So where to start? Well, the organization that I lead, Perspectiva, describes its work in many different ways, but one of the things we're interested in is the kind of transformative education we need to get ourselves into proper relationship with the challenges of our time. By that, I mean, there are some who say that in order to contend with the burgeoning global collective action problems we face, of which climate change is preeminent and ecological catastrophe more generally is preeminent, there is also war and the prospect of nuclear war. There is also something about our relationship to artificial intelligence that needs to be properly understood before it moves beyond human control. There are things about synthetic biology and changing the very nature of life, things about virtual reality and what it means to, what reality is today when we have so many forms of mediated contact with it. Then there's the war in our attention, our inability to hold a thought or concentrate for extended periods. sometimes these things together are called the meta-crisis, which is a way of describing that there's not just one problem. It's not just that there's an issue with homelessness or there's an issue with the economy, but rather there's something about the underlying nature of the way the world's operating at the moment at scale that's giving rise to a certain kind of problem that cannot be solved on the level it was created. So it requires a different kind of way of looking at things, experiencing things, and knowing things to give ourselves a chance of, at the very least, surviving, if not thriving. So that's the kind of, that's where Perspectiva comes from. It's sort of a commitment to understand that premise that we're somehow in a time between worlds, where one world appears to be slowly but surely falling away. The world of nation states and free markets and individual rights and the world that we thought that we were converging on doesn't seem to be able to address the major challenges of our time adequately. So it's by no means a call for revolution. It's just a call to sort of wake up to the objective features of the conundrum that we're all living in, look at the pattern that connects them, look at how serious it all is, and then ask ourselves what's going on. And so that's the first meaning of realization in some ways. The first meaning of realization is to realize what's happening. It's to get real. It's to actually really look into the nature of our pickle that we're in, which has many different aspects. It has aspects in the sort of systemic world and the nature of the economic systems and political systems and ecological systems, but it also has aspects in our souls, in our relationship to the meaning, nature, and purpose of life. And then, of course, as if that wasn't complex enough, it has a deep, deep challenge in how we conceive of it together, how we make sense of it for each other, how we symbolize the predicament we're living in. But it does appear that we're in a phase of history that's in some sense thicker than other historical periods, that there's a transition underway that we appear to be part of. Now, for those who are more academically inclined, I think there's an empirical basis to that. I think there's a sort of factual basis based on patterns of demand and supply and technological development and population movement. And there are ways of framing that give it some dry land. But for those who are more mystically or poetically inclined, it's something that many of us just feel, that the world that we've known is not quickly, not tomorrow, but somehow inexorably transforming and changing. So the first meaning of realization is sort of to wake up to that, to realize what's going on, to realize that we're part of the story of being in a time between worlds. And that's quite a big thing. It takes time to realize that. You need to speak about it, you need to discuss it. Not everyone experiences it in the same way, with the same intensity. People conclude different things about what follows from it. But it is a chance to get together and experience that kind of realization, that maybe this is a particularly loaded, meaningful historical moment that we find ourselves a part of. Now, of course, every generation thinks that. It hasn't escaped our attention. But we might be right, as they all say. I think in this case, we actually can launch an argument that we're right, and that's to do with a shift in geological time. We have actually moved beyond, it would appear, the stable conditions of the Holocene. And as a result, the systems and structures that made the Holocene subsist and work will not be adequate for the Anthropocene, or what some call the Capitalocene. In other words, not just that it's the humans influencing the planet, but it's the humans with a particular economic and political model shaping the planet in a certain way. So the first meaning of realization is that all of that. It's like taking stock to realize something, to realize what's going on. And it's not just, my verdict on this. Please don't think you'll come into the room and I'm just giving the overview here. Many of the people we're inviting share some kind of sensibility of this nature, that we're in a particularly interesting historical moment. We're living through a big transition that's beyond any of us. But that's the first thing to realize. The second meaning of realization is a little more spiritual, a little more psychological, a little more interior. It's to realize the self. It's a story of self-realization, of becoming. The sort of ancient Greek term might be eudaimonia. It's something about the flourishing of the self, becoming who you're meant to be. And the interesting thing about that kind of realization, to realize, to become who you're meant to be, to realize the self, is that it connects in quite an interesting way to the first meaning of realization, because you come to know who you are partly because of your historical context, because of the times you're living in, the challenges that face you. If you want to know who you are and what you should do, to some extent look within, but to some extent also look without. Look at how you're needed. What do you need to learn? What do you need to know? Who do you need to be? That's a big part of the context. To become what you're meant to be in this moment, to learn what you need to learn, to grow in the way you need to grow, to change in the way you need to change, to let go and move beyond the things that maybe you thought you were going to live through. So the second meaning of realization is a spiritual sense of the self growing over time, but particularly coming to know itself in its historical and environmental milieu. I can't say that word without sounding awfully pretentious, but I do like it. So it's something about that. It's sort of, and that's one of the reasons the realization venue, the St. Giles context, is so rich, because when you're there, history is kind of palpable. You really feel this place has been here for a long time, longer than me, longer than my grandparents, longer than their grandparents. And that's something beautiful and deep, because you just feel that you're part of this long human story, and that yourself, your individual self, you know, your Ed and your Simon and your Leigh and your Ellen and your Lauren and your Megan and your Vanessa and Jennifer and Jaolu and Andrew and Helen and Hilly and Fraser and Travis and Pippa and Mark and Nick and Jonathan, I guess, that it's about each of us individually, not just as a collective, not just as some sort of generic amorphous people, but each of us individually, our unique self-story, somehow relating to the story of our times, this time of being between worlds, where one world is passing away and another is yet to be born, that we find ourselves through that story and within it in a meaningful way. So that's the second kind of realization. Realization as in to become real. And the third kind of realization is very practical. It's like, what are you going to do? Like, let's act. What is your life's work? What are your projects? What are your initiatives? What do you feel called upon to make or cooperate on or build or destroy or campaign for or activate? The third meaning of realization is to make real, and it's the realization as in the realization of an idea. I realize my dream to create a cafe, and it's going to be a very special cafe that acts as a charity simultaneously, and it's going to deal with the climate conundrum through educational workshops with cappuccinos and cookies every Wednesday lunchtime or whatever. But there's this kind of thing of you have an idea, but you need to realize it. You need to make it happen. You need to make it real. So that's in some ways the most obvious one. It could be a book, it could be an organization, it could be a campaign, it could be a song, you know, but something about your role in making something manifest. So there's the three meanings for you laid out in a nutshell. To get real, to realize what's going on, to become real, to know yourself and realize the self in this historical moment, and to make real, to find your unique contribution to your life and times, to make something happen, make real, make something manifest. So those are all kind of in the soup, if you like, that we're all taking part of and imbibing at the festival. And they set the scene, but then what follows from that is a little bit open, because for some, you know, the middle bit's the most interesting. It's all about the soul, and it's all about the spirit, and it's all about, you know, feeling your unique relationship to the divine in some way. Or for others, it's just like, I'll leave them to it. I want to get busy and get active and get something done. And then for others, it's like, I want to talk about what's really happening here. Is it really a time between worlds? Like, are you sure? Didn't they all say that? And that kind of combination of broadly thinking, doing, and being is part of what makes it a rich tapestry of people, a sort of interesting social fabric at the festival. We try and make sure that through the speakers and to some extent through the people we invite, and to some extent through those who are given bursary places, that there's enough variety in the network of people there. So there's not just a kind of group thing, that those who want to find people like them can, but they're also encouraged to be with others who are not like them. And that's part of the commitment of being there. there is a sense in which we're asked you to be there to allow yourself to change in some way. You know, it's not just to chill out in the country, although there is that, and you're likely to have a great time. There is a hedonic side to this. But that's not all that's going on. That's all that was happening. You could do that in the pub. It's not what it's about. So come to the Realisation Festival, I would say, to encounter that kind of realization, where there's a mixture of the analysis of the historical moment through our great speakers, your own encounter with that through your own self-story and who you're becoming, and how the festival might help you to feel into that more deeply through the people you meet and the experiences you have. And then finally, what follows? What are you going to do now? And that's all part of the encounter. So that's how I see Realisation, and that's the sort of philosophical underpinning of what the festival's about. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. That's absolutely brilliant, and a wonderful introduction into what we are trying to achieve during the weekend at the Realisation Festival. Now, as Jonathan said, the space that we're going to be in, St Giles House, is actually a really special place. And when you're there, you do feel this sense of history and time that has gone before and that will go on. And so we thought it'd be great if Nick Ashley Cooper could talk about this space that is his and why he wanted to open it up and what realisation means to him. So I'll pass over to Nick now.
Thank you, Pippa, and also Jonathan for that great opening, and lovely to be here. Thanks everyone else for sparing your time this evening to find out a little bit more about what we're trying to do. So yeah, I think my piece is really just to explain a little bit more about St Giles, why we're involved in this along with Perspectiva, and why we're really passionate about this event. And I sort of break that down into three parts. One to do with the history, the second, which is more of a personal mission, you could say, and the last being kind of the wider kind of context that we're all grappling with at the moment. So the history, which has been alluded to a bit by Jonathan, is very sort of palpable when you come to St Giles, and it is a really amazing history, and we talk a lot about three individuals in particular, but obviously the place is steeped in it, and it goes way beyond and past those three people, but they seem to sort of loom large, if you like, and been very inspirational for me in terms of this event. And they are the 1st, 3rd and 7th Earl of Shaftesbury's. Quite different people, but all had this very strong sense of the world, human beings, their fellow human beings, and really grappling with some of the challenges of their time. So the 1st Earl of Shaftesbury was essentially a politician, lived in the 17th century in England, and lived through the Civil War here. So was very much sort of confronted with everything that was going on, all the turmoil that was going on. And in a nutshell, really fought against absolutism and the power of the monarch and the arbitrary power of the monarch, and really believed in parliamentary democracy, if you like, a very early proponent of a sort of the parliamentary system and having checks and balances on power, which is interesting in our current context, obviously, with the war raging in Ukraine. His very close friend and confidant was the philosopher John Locke, and he had a very interesting career spanning lots of different things, but Locke spent a good portion of his life living at St Giles, and I like to imagine both of those two individuals really thinking through everything that was going on in the world, and setting out all of their ideas and philosophies that have become so influential, if you like, for all of us. And the second, actually, Locke had a direct influence on the second really interesting individual, the third Earl of Charlesbury, who was a philosopher in his own right and an Enlightenment thinker, and had a big influence across Europe at that particular time in the 18th century. And he had a very strong sense on morality, and actually believed that there was this, that we were born with a moral sense, that we didn't act out of sort of being coerced or forced or sense, structures of power, that we intuitively knew what was right and wrong, and were drawn to things that felt morally right in a way that was intuitive to us. And I always think that's a very beautiful idea, and sort of somehow something that we come back to in our event. So this sense of beauty and intuition. And then the next really influential person that lived at St. Giles was the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, who was a social reformer and really dedicated his life to trying to improve conditions for other people living at the time. And he was very much born in the 19th century and surrounded by all of the huge inequalities during the Industrial Revolution in England, and had to deal with children being forced to work in mines and awful conditions in factories, and really campaigned his whole life to try and improve those conditions, and is commemorated actually in Piccadilly Circus with this statue of Eros, which was resembling his selfless love for other people. So these three individuals who lived at St. Giles have given this place this incredible DNA, if you like, and I've always felt that it has this quality about it that makes you think very deeply, and in some ways feel very inspired by some of the people that have been here before. So that's kind of a part of the history of the place. But then there's also, for me, a very strong personal mission, and that was that I took over the house. The house has been in my family for many generations, but I wasn't the person to look after the house at all. That was my brother, and he sadly died when he was in his 20s, and so I sort of came off the substitutes bench to try and think of what to do. And that was also another challenging time for my family, because not long before he died, my father had also passed away. So I lost two very close people in my life quite quickly. And St. Giles at that time was nothing more than a very sad, falling down place that actually hadn't been lived in for many years. So like a lot of these old buildings, it had fallen on pretty tough times following the war. And during the war years, it had been used as a school, actually. They'd been evacuated from London. And then following the Second World War, it had never really kind of found its feet again. And had slowly fallen into disrepair over about the period from about the sort of mid-60s to when I came, which was early 2000s. So it was this big problem in a way. And my whole life growing up, I had seen it as this place that its time had passed. There wasn't any life or soul left in it at all. But after some years of being back and being in the role of being the custodian, suddenly, I started to have this plan and sense to try and get a foothold back in the place. And I was very lucky to have a partner on my side who was perhaps mad enough to join me on this mission. And we started in 2010 to start to restore the house. And at that time, it was a very simple plan, really, just to start to, get some sections of the house habitable, and then figure out what we're going to do next. It was in some ways quite a naive, romantic idea that got us going. But then once we were in, things started to snowball, and we realized we needed an income to keep the place going. So we set about doing events, and that kind of motivated us to do a bit more and more of the house to get more of it usable, so we could have public there. And it's really been this incredible journey that is still going on 12 years later. So I think we hosted our first event, which was a wedding, in 2013. And now most of the house is done up, and we're doing lots of those types of events. And there's really a kind of buzz about the place. But I think some years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when it felt like St. Giles had turned the corner and the business was up and running and things felt secure and stable, our minds churned from not just a sort of sense of survival and just could we do it, to now that we're here, what is the point of all of this? Why did we do this in the first place? Was it just a kind of crazy plan, and now it's sort of semi-succeeded? It's got to mean something more than just being here and running weddings or doing other events. So we thought really long and hard about, I guess you could say, what's the purpose of all of this work? And we knew inside that we really wanted St. Giles to have a deeper purpose. And I guess for me, that was looking back at this history, looking back at its DNA and the great people that have been there and what they brought to the place. And could we reuse the house for those kinds of purposes? And on that journey, I was very fortunate to meet Jonathan, and we started to talk about what became, the seeds of the idea that became Realisation as we see it today. And I should say there's something very natural about using this house as a place where people can step out of their day-to-day, come down and really think deeply. It felt like a sort of obvious way for us to channel things. So that's something that has really come about in recent years, and we're really passionate about, and really want this to be what St. Giles is here for. But then there was also this sense for me on a personal note of understanding some of the issues that were going on in the wider world and the wider context. And it just seems that we've been through an enormous amount of different things in the last sort of 5 years, you could say. Obviously, climate change has been this growing issue that we're all really coming to terms with. But then, of course, we sort of went headlong into the pandemic and COVID and all of those different challenges that we all had to live through. And now we're sort of spinning into this awful war in Ukraine and everything that's throwing up. And it just seems that we need an event like this more than ever, an event that brings people together, where we can really try and get to the bottom of some of these challenges and share our thoughts, our fears, our thinking together, and try and reimagine what a world could be like where some of these things can be, if not solved, improved, and our lives can be bettered by that. So that's where I am personally. I really think about these things a lot, and it's fantastic. Now we're in our second year and we're able to host this event. So thank you very much, and I'll pass back to you, Pippa.
Thanks so much, Nick. That was great. Really great to hear. I mean, really great to hear exactly what brought you to the project, but also to give people a sense of St. Giles, because I do think it's a sort of place which you can't really understand until you're stood in the grounds of it, actually. But good for us to have a go. we're going to pass on to Xiaolu in a second, who came as a participant last year and this year is coming, came as a speaker last year and is returning to lead a workshop for us this year. But one of the things that we wanted to talk about also was like, who is this festival for? And we couldn't sort of come up with classic sort of demographics. It's not like we said, oh, it's for young people at age 18 to 25, or we couldn't put people in these brackets. So we came up with this list, and I just wanted to read these out to you and see if they chime with you as a way to recognize if this feels like something that is drawing you in. We thought that this festival was aimed at deep thinkers, exhausted activists, lonely warriors, recovering achievers, curious sailors, aspiring hopefuls, dejected intellectuals, burnt-out travellers, open-minded cynics, overwhelmed romantics, fellow sufferers, sure unshores, and wounded jesters. Those were the terms that we came up with, and I just wonder if any of them chime with you, or if you can think of your own, do feel free to put them into the chat, because we'd love to know how you would describe yourself as someone who's interested in coming to the Realisation Festival. But for now, I'll pass over to Xiaolu Go, and I wonder, Xiaolu, how you would describe yourself.
Thank you very much, Peppa. And I can only speak from a speaker's point of view from last year's experience. So I'll be less intense than Jonathan. I do remember last year, first year, Jonathan opened up the structure of the festival, the structure of the publishing house, which is quite very impressive. A lot of deep stuff, which takes me a year to understand, first 3 sentences, but it's amazing. And it will be less so comprehensive than Nick, who was a wonderful host last year. And I remember I came into this estate with vast land, completely lost. The first thing I want to do is just walk on this land on the wheat fields. And Nick said, okay, don't get lost. And I was lost after about 45 minutes. Then I remember this kind of wandering around before, the events taking over. And I think those were the moments, kind of my favorite moments, truly lost on the land, which I have no understanding, what was it, until Nick explained to me, the wheat fields were there, the barleys were there, and this is a rosemary area. You don't worry about it. So I think it's a very interesting festival for me because it's totally unusual. It's very difficult to define it, which is amazing. And as Peppa said, those words, these are the people who come to the festival. And I remember all the speakers are very, I think, quite intense and very relaxed at the same time. And the people like Mark, for example, and Indra, I think also Evo, I find, they work between as a kind of social anthropologist or social psychologist, and spiritual leaders, these kind of roles, and very non-academic, but at the same time have this academic depth, which we can learn and share and discuss after each speech. So it's kind of mixed between very intense brainstorm and also very physical, beautiful relaxation. Especially I remember Peppa led us one performance art with everyone's called Invisible Ball, something like that. So we had to pass invisible ball between each other in the next beautiful one of the living rooms with all the classical paintings. And I think those things were, really my favorite moments under the dinner time, of course. And those moments also very important. For example, I think after lunch, the walks through the fields and by the lake. And I remember, we were being separated different groups and I try to reflect what we have kind of learned or discussed in the morning. So from last year's experience, that's the only experience we all had. But I think it's a lot to copy, to continue in a way, because the morning hours, I remember being very intense, speaking, thinking a lot. And after the lunch, it became a bit looser, and we can walk around doing physical things, enjoy the beauty of the nature, and then reflect. So those things, I think, I can, I think as kind of very rich takeaway. But most important thing, I think, Jonathan led is very varied discussion, to do with future ecological issues, but also spirituality. Especially Mark was very, beautiful, intense about certain things, religious in different direction. So even me come from very different culture, religious background, I find very enriching. So I hope this year will be a great continuation and some kind of new, a different type of joy we have to discover in June. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Xiaolu. So it's great to hear from Jonathan and from Nick and from Xiaolu. And does anyone have any questions that they want to ask before we close this meeting? They could be questions about something you've heard, or they could be, super practical questions like, do you have a spare sleeping bag? You can either put them in the chat or just feel free to raise your hand and speak.
I could ask a question, Pippa.
Great,
Jennifer's raised her hand as well. Let's not miss that. Just to ask you, fellow programmer, how we've tried to develop the program this year.
Oh, it's a great question, Mark. Thank you for asking. Well, we really did try and mix up this idea of the thinking and doing and being. Essentially was our kind of core place, because we did want something different. We didn't want people to be overwhelmed by information, because we also feel like that's where we are at the moment, is constantly overwhelmed by information. So to come somewhere where we might actually start to explore the information that we arrive with, and be given certain points of view, certain ways of thinking. We also wanted to make sure that it was very practical. There's things that we do. We actually do things, working with the nature in St. Giles, working with our bodies and our souls, and also to give people downtime. So Nick and Jonathan both mentioned that we did this smaller festival last year because of lockdown and COVID and everything. It was much smaller, and one of the feedbacks we got was there was a lot of talking, a lot of being talked to, and so we've really sort of tried to pare that down to the point of which we still are getting some really delicious, rich talks, but we do also have time to sit with our own thoughts and to sit with each other's thoughts. So I feel like that's where we ended up playing, wasn't it, Mark? Great. You don't want to add anything, Mark? Just looking. No,
that's a wonderful resume. Thank you very much. I completely agree, which is just as well. But I noticed Jennifer waved her hand. I don't know whether she's
Jennifer, please.
Yes. Hello. It all sounds very interesting, and one of the reasons I wanted to come along this evening, because I was slightly concerned that it was all about, I haven't really ever explored my spiritual, mystical, poetic part of me, and if it was going to be, perhaps more of that, well, perhaps it's a good time to do that anyway, but I was pleased to see I probably fit into some of your categories, so I'd be very interested to come along, I think.
Well, that's great, Jennifer. That's felt like less of a question and more of an endorsement.
Yes. So.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognise that we've got these different categories and different ways of being. There is choice, so there's multiple choices on different days of things you can take part in. So if you feel like actually this is the time I want to explore that spiritual part of me, you can absolutely find yourself on a path to do that. But if you feel like, no, actually I still want to stay in the intellectual, we can stay there too. So we really have tried to design it so that people can stretch themselves as much or as little as they feel that they can at that weekend, at that time.
Oh, good. Sounds excellent.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jennifer. Did anyone else have any question before we close? You can put it, you don't have to talk out loud, you can put it in the chat if you'd like.
Looks like Helen has a question.
Thank you. Helen, would you like to unmute and ask?
Yes, thank you very much. It sounds very interesting. And actually, I already registered for last year, but I did not feel that I would be one of the 100 people who could come last year because of COVID. But today, for the coming period, I'm really considering it. And I have a lot of questions, actually. I have questions about how many people were there last year, how many people do you expect this year? How do you combine, how do you meld together the intellectual and the spiritual thing? Like you said, Pippa, to stretch it, but where does it come together? I heard that somewhere, or actually I didn't hear it, but I hear it in what was actually not said. I heard it between the lines that it is combined or intertwined. How does that work? Can you give an impression of that? And were there initiatives coming from the event from last year that were going through even after the closure of the festival? And can you give examples of that?
Great, thank you. Those are three very good questions. The first one, just a very simple maths question, is last year we had 30 people, and this year we will have a maximum of, I believe, 100 people. For the spiritual question, maybe Mark, that feels like a question that you would answer very well, because it is, as you say, Helen, it's sort of implied that they meet, and partly how that occurs is because it's present, rather than say explicitly forced together. Would that be fair, Mark?
Yeah, I think actually picking up on some of the things Jonathan was alluding to and saying, that the notion of realization itself asks more than one side of us. So it's not just the head, it's also the heart, but also this felt sense of the soul and spirit as well. And then also the dimension that is individual, but also is shared. And so is alert to history, current events, the future, and different parts of the world. And this, how the times are both alarming, but also inviting almost. Can we really discover new aspects of our humanity that maybe have been forgotten? And St. Giles being such a great place to do that, because it's precisely, particularly the 3rd and the 7th Earl, that is very much their contribution, that did have a big impact at the time, both in terms of social reform and, well, intellectual movements that were both intellectual and spiritual, because the 3rd Earl was a seminal figure in what became known as the Romantic movement, and was very influential on figures like Goethe. So it's a tremendous place where all of that can be called forth. And we hope the programme, provides moments that then can combine.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, that's brilliant. And in terms of the third question about what's come out of last year, so last year was sort of really unique and will never be able to be repeated simply because it was this strange 30 people, which included us, included the program managers and everything. So really what's come out of that is relationships being fostered. And I think I sort of would like to quote another Jonathan Rowelson thing here, which is his phrase, the urgent 100-year project. And the idea that rather than sort of trying to force, we had the Realisation Festival and 6 new charities have appeared and 17 different projects have appeared. Actually, what's wonderful is, for example, Xiaolu's coming back. Damien Hallam, who came as a guest last year, is speaking about his experience of working with the land and speaking to the, essentially the vegan revolution. Is that the answer? I think that would be a really fascinating conversation to have, because a lot of people will come from the city, bring their ideas, and we'll have people from near around Wimborne, St. Giles coming to actually contribute. So really at the moment, what we could say is that the last year's festival simply fostered relationships, and that actually is just very exciting to know that there's people that want to come back and want to stay in touch. Thank you for those questions, Helen. Are we going to add something, Jonathan?
Yeah, just to speak to the place of the intellect in the festival, because it's a good question and it does come up quite a lot. A lot of people are concerned somehow that it will be sort of dominated by debate and discussion that's somehow abstract or philosophical or I don't know, requires prior knowledge or something like that. But I would say that one of the reasons I like the sort of organizational dynamics and ethos of the festival is that I think the intellect's kind of in its proper place. In other words, it's respected, it's dignified, it's acknowledged, it's used, it's valued. But there's also a sense of that most of the people there don't really expect the transformation to come from the intellect as such. They see it as a kind of important servant and ally, but not a kind of deity. They're more interested in the kind of beauty, imagination, and calling of the moment than winning a particular argument. So I think, yes, there's quite a lot of intellectual firepower in amongst the people who come and speak and so forth. But I would say what's being valued is not so much the intellectual power. It's more what it's pointing towards and the context in which it's arising. So it's not what it's about, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, if there aren't any more burning questions, I think we're going to call this to a close. I'm just checking for any hands. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us. As I said, the Realisation Festival is running at St Giles House in Dorset from June the 9th to the 12th of this very year. Tickets are available via our website, which I believe is realisationfestival.com.